Hello, and thanks for being with us today on Collapse Life. I'm your host, Zahra Sethna. Our guest today has 32 years of combined active duty in the Navy and the Department of Defense. She has dedicated her career to protecting America through efforts in national security, intelligence, warfare, strategic planning, and public policy. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Crisanna Shackelford in our virtual studio today to talk about a very concerning development we appear to be experiencing here in America, but increasingly around the world. That development is the very real concept of asymmetric warfare. And Dr. Shackelford is going to walk us through how multiple crises and increasingly confusing occurrences are the telltale signs we've moved past fifth generation warfare and are entering a dangerous new age. Dr. Shackelford, thank you for being here today to talk about this very serious and very important subject.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, your PhD was in public policy, complex environments, and nonlinear warfare.
Mhm.
And that last term might not be something that's very familiar to people. So, I wanted to start by asking you to give us a definition of nonlinear warfare. What does it mean?
Yeah, that's a great. I mean, it's a great way to start this discussion. I think first and foremost, we need to frame the words nonlinear warfare into an analytic discussion. In other words, it's a methodology. It's how you think about what you're seeing out there and how do you analyze that problem. So first and foremost, nonlinear warfare is the discussion, and I frame it in the discussion of complex systems, complex adaptive systems. So what you're going to have is a set of behavioral characteristics that would be evolution, coevolution, adaptation, emergence, dynamic change. So you can see by the use of those words, I'm actually discussing something that is very, very interdependent, very, very interactive. So first and foremost, as military scientists, if you will, those that think about warfare, as they think about warfare, they have to have a critical mindset in terms of how they think things are going to unfold in that adversarial space, in that battle space, if you will. A lot of folks will say, um, and actually as you discussed it, there are half a dozen different terms that describe different types of warfare: insurgency warfare, irregular warfare, asymmetric warfare is the term that you used. Um, there are many, many, many different terms. Hybrid warfare is another example. Reflexive control is an example. It's something that Soviets might have used if you were to uh, dive deep into quote unquote sort of Chinese doctrine in terms of warfare. They would describe their thought process, their analytic thought process, as something about how they frame and look for the potential in the future environment. In other
Hmm.
words, they're looking for change in that future. So they understand that things are in a constant state of change. In fact, I will just offer typically in the United States, if someone comes through sort of traditional warfare studies programs, a couple of terms I believe, trip people up. Well, first and foremost is the term end state. There's no such thing as end in warfare. There's
Mm-hmm.
constantly change in that battle space that could put the trajectory of your objectives off. There's always going to be injects, if you will, into that battle space. So there's no such thing as an end state. There may be a nanosecond of a fixed point in time in the future where we can say, war's over, we've declared peace. But in reality, all of these events continue and they continue to manifest in different ways. So you could,
Mm-hmm.
technically achieve a goal, but the goal is still going to be influenced by other events. So again, it's as an example, as an intelligence analyst, um, I also would be and have been responsible for basically describing, if you will, characterizing a particular, warfare event or series of events. And it's important that you understand that we understand that methodology comes into play because a typical analyst, let's say, comes out of the of a domain of, let's say you're a poli sci major or you're a history major or you're an international relations major. Methodology would be, I'm going to do a case study analysis of how I think about things. Well, case study doesn't get you to complexity. Case
Mm-hmm.
study analytics do not get you to nonlinearity. So we find ourselves in an environment where we have not necessarily framed nor have we understood warfare as a nonlinear set of behaviors, if you will. So it's a long way to say that's warfare.
Yeah. And so there's a lot for us to unpack there over the next few minutes. And yeah, obviously, complexity and non-linearity and what that looks like, all very important. But I kind of wanted to, just before we dive in, let's just set the scene for those of us who are not intelligence or military strategist or involved in the military. Why, for those of us who are non-experts, is it important for us to understand this? What's important about this moment and the global situation we're in and how this kind of fits in?
So let me answer this by backing up just a second. In your intro, you had said we have moved past fifth generation warfare. So I want to pull that thread for just a second
Great.
as it explains why it's more important to understand that what is happening is critical, but how to understand it. And I'll just pull the fifth generation warfare thread for a second. It's a metaphor, and it's been used a lot recently. There's a huge problem with the term fifth generation warfare. And the first problem is it's an evolutionary biological metaphor that assumes that we've evolved from the second to the third to the fourth to the fifth, which is a linear evolutionary process. And again, what's the analytic methodology? If you were the analyst sitting at the Defense Intelligence Agency or the Central Intelligence Agency or NSA or pick another agency, if you were the analyst and you had to say, oh, this is, what they're waging is fifth generation warfare, how would you analyze it? What methodology do you bring to the table? So it's a very, very unfortunate metaphor that has been bandied about, and we haven't actually evolved from fifth generation warfare. It has always been nonlinear warfare.
Okay.
So I just wanted to reset that. And so
Okay.
with that, to your point, to your question, because it has always been nonlinear, I believe it's important to first and foremost understand that we need to critically think about and be able to view, if you will, describe, characterize all these interdependent activities that are taking place around the world. And we need to be concerned because we are at a moment in time as these systems, if you will, there are political systems, there are ideological systems, there are warfare capability systems. As these systems are beginning to, for lack of a better word, co-evolve, and I don't want to say grow in strength because again I'm mixing my analogies when I say that, but just let me just work through this. What we're witnessing at this particular point um, is critical because there's an additional inject into the battle space, if you will. And the particular inject that I want to talk about just briefly is the digital capabilities.
Mm.
So as we begin to basically lock in all of these disparate efforts through the power of the satellite communications, through the power of the grid systems, through the power of all the capabilities that we now have to track and trace, to begin to pull data from multiple sources. That force in and of itself is also locking in, if you will, a significant change that is going to impact our future. And we need to understand that as a part of when we talk about what are the systems in play, what are those things on that battlefield, if you will, that are changing the trajectory of what's actually happening to us. And then from there, we can go ahead and develop that foresight picture with a better understanding of why that foresight picture is of concern. I call it a dystopian future, but of concern. Then that, to me, I think helps explain where we're at today and how we view the problem.
Mm-hmm. It might help if we talk about some examples to kind of lay this all out and bring it to life a little bit. Do you have some examples that we can
I
use?
do. I shared with you a slide, and I think it's useful sometimes people are visual to basically go, oh, that's a hot mess. So what you have on the screen, thank you for bringing that up. Um, During the Obama administration, so this is going to be the example. During the Obama administration, Afghanistan was, it was a significant effort for us, and basically, the administration said to then General McChrystal, he said, "I want you to prevent the Taliban at the time from gaining access into a safe haven, which was known as the FATA, the Federally Administered Tribal Areas." General McChrystal basically said, with all due respect, sir, I can achieve your policy objective, which was very narrowly scoped in reality, even though maybe it sounded very broad, just to, just prevent the Taliban from getting into the Fatah. In reality, it was very narrowly focused because it failed to understand the complexity of that environment. So on the screen, what you actually have there is an example of complex adaptive systems. You had examples of the narcotics trade being directly tied to the Afghanistan capabilities to deal with that. You have Iranian influence. You have all of these different events that are all connected. Some are in enhancing each other or reinforcing or hardening each other. Others are competing. So you have all of these efforts basically unfolding. And General McChrystal on the ground in Afghanistan had to solve all of that at the same time because all of those complex adaptive systems were occurring, all the changes were occurring, all the outside influences were coming in. He couldn't get to a policy objective until he solved all of these other problems. So
Mhm.
that's an example of nonlinear warfare. That's an example of complex adaptive systems. And that is, I think, a very good visual representation of the challenges that we face because you could also take and make that diagram, if you will, and extrapolate from that into basically current day. And you could substitute and you could say we've got, things like the World Health Organization, the IHR amendments, we have influences from NIH, we have influences from DOD, BARDA, DARPA, all these other organizations, external influences, internal efforts across the states with public health officials, all trying to jockey for and influence their own version of a policy objective, you know. And so you've got all these competing interests, and you can call that the battleground, if you will, but you'd have the very same problem. So, as an example, if somebody declared, if this particular administration decided that what we need to do is have a One Health policy, we need to be joined with the World Health Organization. That's the policy objective that the administration would be trying to achieve, not dissimilar to the one during the Obama administration that said, prevent the Taliban from going into the Fatah. But with that, you have a huge problem. How will the administration achieve that objective when, in fact, you have all of these other events that are taking place inside, and I'll use the word battlefield, if that makes
Mhm.
sense?
Mhm. So, would you say that this methodology of thinking about things in a nonlinear way is actually being used at the moment with our military or with the military of our adversaries? Is there enough attention on thinking this way or using this methodology?
Um, the short answer is within the US, no. And I will explain it this way. Again, I just briefly alluded to the fact that Chinese warfare largely is about looking for the potential in the future environment. And as, let me use another example. Typically in the United States, we kind of sort of say, hey, we're the masters of chess and we understand strategy and we've got this chessboard and we know how to move the pieces around. And as a result of that, we're the great thinkers and we unleash our warfighting capabilities around the world, and that military mindset is locked into a fixed way of thinking. Chinese warfare is actually related to, I won't say rooted in, a game called Go, Go. And in this game of Go, you actually have pieces on the board, but what you're looking for is the potential.
Mm.
You're looking for a potential opportunity. So within Chinese warfare mentality, they're actually looking for the potential in the future environment. It sounds very Zen, doesn't it? It sounds like, you're going to watch the water move and flow and go on, but it's actually a completely different way of thinking.
Mhm.
Likewise, with then the Russians, our Soviet warfare doctrine, also as early as the 1940s, had their own doctrine of nonlinear warfare. Those were their words. So there has been a lot of work with our adversaries in terms of how to think about complex warfare as a whole. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. How
Yeah.
do you think about leveraging your political power, your economic power, your social and cultural power? How do you think about all of those as pieces on the board to influence and affect a change that another nation would like to achieve. And largely, what I'm describing, a way of thinking about warfare, resides in sort of niche areas within the Department of Defense, specifically the armed forces, in the war colleges. It's not typically taught. In fact, the word that they use is design theory as opposed to sort of traditional warfare theory. So it's incredibly frustrating. We will talk about, the fact that we understand, psychological warfare, information warfare. In fact, typically, I'll go back to that, my concern over the term fifth generation warfare, but typically, if it is being discussed, it's discussed as an advanced state of information warfare or the war for the cognitive mind. We talk about cognitive warfare as well. So there's a lot of terms out there. But again, if you took all the terms away, I believe if you just said we understand warfare as a constant state of change that evolves, adapts, co-evolves, has an emergence characteristic, and it's dynamic, we would not get hung up on the reductionist mindset of thinking about the bits and parts as opposed to thinking about the whole, if that makes sense.
It sort of makes sense, and there's still a lot more, but it's fascinating, and it leads me to a number of questions. One is, and I'm going to give very simplistic explanations, so please feel free to correct me. But it seems like the previous understanding of warfare was you knew when you were involved in a war. You had troops in place, and there were weapons that were visible. I guess that it has evolved a little bit, again, in my simplistic viewpoint, with the use of drones and proxies and things like that. But um, what seems to come now, especially over the last few years, is this idea that maybe with nonlinear warfare, or with this sort of psychological warfare, that we may be involved in some sort of conflict that hasn't been declared. We don't even know that we are actively involved in a conflict. Is that correct?
It's 100% correct, in the sense that the average person on the street typically thinks of oh my God, we're in battle, we're in war is upon us because tanks have rolled down the street, rockets are flying, buildings are being bombed. That is not necessarily the case anymore. And I use the word the softening of the battlefield. So if an adversary, and I would argue has, let's just say over the last 10, 20 years, wanted to soften the battlefield and sort of ripen, for to their advantage, uh, enhance their abilities to continue to win, what they would end up doing is targeting the United States differently, whether it's creating chaos in our universities, whether it's reinforcing particular behaviors, whether it is influencing migration efforts as an example, whatever. That softening of the battlefield is taking place. So the average American is looking around, they're not seeing tanks, they're not seeing rockets, they're not seeing mortars, they're not seeing this. So therefore, we're not necessarily in war. War happens over there in the Middle East. Warfare happens over there in Afghanistan or somewhere else. But to their way of thinking, it's not happening here. We know we have societal conflicts, but we're not typically thinking about warfare that, in the sense that our adversaries have already understood that if they can soften our battlefield, they can look for the potential in the future environment. Then they can seize an opportunity in the future once whatever their desired objectives have been achieved, let's say here in the United States. So you're absolutely correct about that.
So interesting. And nonlinear warfare, what you just described there, may have different goals than conventional warfare. And you already talked about, having an end state is kind of the wrong way of thinking about it. How are the goals different with nonlinear warfare?
It's not necessarily that the goals are different. It's I think I appreciate what you just said. There are tactical capabilities, military capabilities, if you will, um, the harnessing, if you will, of the entirety of an adversary's capability. So what ends up happening is there will be discrete lines of effort, if you will, to achieve an overall end state goal, not end state, to achieve some objective out there.
Mhm.
That's important to understand. So there are multiple competing things that will be happening in that battle space, but it's all for the same end, if you will. And again, I don't like the word end,
Mhm.
but it's to achieve that same goal, if that makes sense.
Right. Right. I mean, it seems like we are in a phase where things are very confusing. There's a loss of trust. Um, it feels like we are being pitted against each other almost purposefully,
Mhm.
and just really kind of moving through shadows and darkness, where things once seemed clear, they're no longer clear. Is that all part of this kind of weaponization?
It is, and interestingly enough, I would phrase it this way: we have adversaries both foreign and domestic, and have to understand that a lot of what's taking place, specifically right now within the United States, is an internal domestic threat, depending on where you are on some of these topics. But the capabilities of a lot of these actors here within the United States, if we're talking about, let's just say, um, the power of the pharmaceutical industries to compel, somebody to, make medical decisions against their will, as an example, aligned with, perhaps even, political efforts, aligned with economic incentive, empowered by digital technologies. We lived through an era of, the track and trace. As I would refer to it, and it's been referred to many times, is that biomedical surveillance state.
Mm.
So internally, depending on where you stand on this topic, that's a threat.
Mhm.
That is something that's happening in our battle space that is dividing and creating chaos within our communities. And the average person, interestingly enough, doesn't know what to do, because you don't call up the Navy, or the Army to solve that problem.
Right.
So, how does somebody, think about their role in that fight, if you will? But again, all of these things are taking place, and
Mhm.
outside influences are also influencing the trajectory of many of these efforts to achieve goals that they want to achieve. And that's the interdependency, that's the
Mhm.
complexity of the threats that we're living in, that we have always lived in, by the way. This is none of this is new.
Right.
It is enabled by technology, the tactics, the techniques, and the procedures. We call that the TTPs. It is enabled by technology and tactics and capabilities and strength of particular weapon systems or particular digital technology, so on and so forth. But none of it's new. It's
Mhm.
just always been, in my opinion, this way. And I think what's happening is most people have a very, very naive view of warfare. Again, terms like this generation warfare do not help in terms of thinking critically about the problem. Um, and also, I think we are ultimately challenged with regard to how to combat what we believe is a threat to humanity. We can, is it? Do we want a future where the only way we can participate in that future, as an example, is to take a medical intervention in order to be a part of the human race?
Right.
If that's something you don't want, then you've got to sit there and ask yourself, how do I participate in solving, um, uh, or how do I participate in that effort to make sure that that doesn't happen? And
Mhm.
again, with the digital capabilities, I think this is the key to a lot of this right now. We are seeing the complexity, the interdependency. It's almost like the proverbial Gordian's knot at this point. How do you untangle all of this and think your way through? How do you develop a campaign strategy? How do you develop a warfare strategy that is in essence a global fight at this point, because you've got threats coming from all over. And we still have to solve for the traditional threats that we will always have.
So it's really interesting that you say this has always been this way, and I don't necessarily disagree with that, but we call this channel Collapse Life because we feel like we're at a moment of massive transition where complexity is a major part of that. When you look at history and you look at the end of empires,
Mhm.
very often complexity is a large part of that. That systems become so heavy, so complex that they ultimately just kind of collapse under their own weight. So when we say collapse, again, I've said this
Mhm.
before, it isn't just an overnight kind of crashing down like you see in the movies. It's just a slow um, giving way under the weight of super complex systems and the breakdown of infrastructure, the breakdown of personal engagement and trust and all of those things. So would you agree in some ways that even though many of these forces have been there before, that we are in a unique moment, perhaps one that's more dangerous than it's been?
Absolutely. In fact, I've got a book literally right to my right. It's a book by Emanuel Wallerstein, and it's The Uncertainties of Knowledge. And there's another one that he wrote, which is about the collapse of systems. I love that you asked this question because for those that want to geek out, if you will, on the academics, if you will, um, or some of the philosophical thinking around systems and the collapse of systems, one of the authors that I refer to is Emanuel Wallerstein, where he talks about exactly what you've described. Systems of systems will actually, in some cases, collapse. Let me just use a really quick example. And it may sound sort of silly, but it may help to the point of collapsed systems. And sometimes I have said, imagine if you were a little boy and you had a bottle of those bubbles where you stick a stick in and you pull the stick out and you blow and bubbles go everywhere, right? Those are complex adaptive systems, if you can imagine. There are big bubbles, there are little tiny bubbles. There are bubbles that sometimes, come together. And as the wind blows, maybe one big bubble will form, but then some of those bubbles will explode. They'll just
Mhm.
collapse. What we're seeing, and imagine all those different bubbles that are moving through the wind are all complex adaptive systems, our social systems, our economic systems, our belief systems. As they go through and the wind takes them away, this is where there's constant change and it's dynamic. There will be a collapse. Other bubbles might come together and like I said, become one big bubble. But
Mhm.
and it sounds like a silly way to kind of sort of explain this, but to your
No.
point, systems do collapse. And this is another thing that we're not taught. We don't think about it. We don't typically go through, K through 12 with, a class in, evolutionary biology or a class in complexity or a course in systems collapse. And we may have had a course in paradigms and, what happens when a paradigm, changes, because that's really about a thought process that's changing about how you view the world that
Mhm.
you're in. But to your point, and I actually love the fact that it's titled Collapse Life because that's exactly what's happening. We are in a significant moment in human history where we're actually seeing, and it's been enabled in large part through the last couple of years when there was a global force that put a massive perturbation into the systems of systems. And that was basically the societal stand down, if you will, around the world globally as a result of the pandemic. But
Mhm.
systems will collapse
Mhm.
and then new systems will come into play. And the tension that we're feeling now is that there are so many efforts within the system to create a new world, if you will, in the image of, whatever somebody wants. I mean, this is kind of sort of very Orwellian, if you will. But
Mhm.
we have lots and lots of influences that have said, I recognize that I have an opportunity
Right.
to create change in the way that I want to. I recognize that I can leverage the digital capabilities, I can leverage the biomedical surveillance state, I can leverage the legal system, through lawfare. There are so many things that are happening right now that we just, over the last 20, 30 years, 40, 50 years even, haven't even ever even had to deal with nor think about. And again, I go back to, we feel the threat, but we don't know who's going to solve that threat.
Mhm.
We don't know what to do about it.
Or we don't even know how to name it. So I think that's why this
Exactly.
conversation is very helpful, because you're helping people to understand some of the forces that are happening. Because I do agree that people feel it. Some people sense it and turn away from it and say, no, that's not happening.
Mhm.
Others sense it but don't know what to make of it. And we all have busy, stressful lives. And so it's
Mhm.
easier to just focus on the few small things that you can control and leave it to someone else, like yourself, to kind of look at the bigger picture. But
And I would argue there's a fear factor in there too. There's
hmm,
a fear factor of, especially since a key lesson learned over the last 3 or 4 years is if you speak out, you're going to be in trouble.
yes.
A very, very interesting phenomenon that took place that is a part of, again, one of the challenges that we face is that self-censoring. Self-censoring because I don't want to pop my head out of that foxhole and get
Hmm.
it shot off, basically, if I want to go back to a warfare discussion. I mean,
Yeah.
but that fear plays into it. And there's sort of, I'm just going to bunker down. I'm going to let somebody else solve for it because
Hmm.
all these rabble rousers over here, there's a really, really strong, basically censorship force. I call it a paragovernmental, not paramilitary, paragovernmental censorship force in
Yes.
play that is very powerful, that has largely been leveraged through, governments and administrations that are using social media companies and corporations to silence quote unquote critics that don't, follow the state sponsored official narrative.
Yeah.
So all of that comes into play where you come back to full circle your point of there are people that just aren't sure and they bunker down.
Hmm.
They've got busy lives. They just want to just make sure that their kids are well fed, that they're healthy, that they're being well educated, that they're safe, and they can just stay in their kind of sort of hermetically sealed, if you will, society. But they know that there's something going on, and they're not sure how to what to your point, what is it? Does it have a name? Is it
Hmm.
just war? That doesn't sound quite right. What do you call this? Do we talk about the collapse of the system? Well, that sounds a little bit academic. Um, when you're talking to, your friends and neighbors, what do we call this? You're absolutely right.
Hmm.
Um, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for all. And again, how do we navigate our capabilities in order to help reinforce change in the direction that we want to go?
Hmm. And I would argue, and I wanted to ask you about this too, that there's a cultural aspect as well. And you've already talked about Chinese war doctrine and maybe the Soviet or the Russian approach, and their culture is very different than our culture. Um, I think as Americans, we are quite an open society. We've had a lot of trust, and for the past several decades, everything has been improving generation upon generation. And so we haven't had to, as you said before, kind of look at what failure looks like, look at what
Mhm.
collapse looks like. It just hasn't been part of our cultural context. So, um, what role do you think that plays in kind of bringing us to where we are, but also looking to the future? Is there a part of that culture that we can preserve, or, in order to kind of come through into whatever the next phase is post collapse, if we call it that?
Mhm.
Because collapse doesn't mean we all go away and stop existing. We just
Right,
come into some new
right.
paradigm, some new system. So, what will that look like culturally for us?
So it's it's interesting the way you said that, and my I wanted to go directly to the challenges that we have in our educational system. I want to pull that thread just a little bit more on methodology and analytics because it goes back to education, but it also goes back to how culture is arranged around basically its understanding, if you will, about the environment that it's in. So we came out of, I'm just going to go back to the Enlightenment period, if you will, where, the Europeans, sat in smoky filled bars and pubs and, pontificated about, how the education system would improve the lives of Europeans. And they, stood up the legal justice system and then the history, experts, and then the various roles of the scientific community and so on. But what I've just described is pillars. the legal system is a pillar, the history system is a pillar, all the academic institutions were in silos.
Hmm.
And one of the interesting things that has happened to us, which I think has sort of put a vice grip, if you will, on our critical thinking skills, is we failed to discuss interdependencies. So again, I sort of right at the beginning, I talked about it. Let's just say if you're an intelligence analyst sitting at CIA or Defense Intelligence Agency, you came out of one of those pillars, out of the international relations pillar or the history pillar, if you will, and you had a methodology that you were sort of taught. Let's say, or maybe you were an anthropologist. That's another
Hmm.
pillar. Well, if you're an anthropologist, you learn to think about longitudinal studies, right? That's what you're going to get into. I say all that to say, as a culture, we've also got embedded into our thinking a way to arrange that culture, to think about that culture, and that influences how society is stood up and so on and so forth. But if we don't understand the interdependencies, then what ends up happening, we have a generation of children that become adults, who become policymakers, who go into again the education system again. You have a very, very, very bifurcated, reductionist set of ways of thinking about how to develop a cultural system. And that's a challenge. So I go all the way back to, and it sounds kind of off, even as I think about it, to say in order to influence cultural change, you've got to influence the education system.
Hmm.
You've got to get back to an explanation early on in childhood that helps a child understand how to think critically about complexity, because that is the norm. It is. That is the
Hmm.
way that everything unfolds. If you were to become, I use the example, if you're a doctor, and actually we all can probably relate to this. You go to the doctor and you say, doctor, I've got heart problems, or I've got a shoulder pain, or, I've got a leg issue. The doctor is like, well, I'm a leg specialist or I'm a heart specialist, so I'll talk to you only about your heart.
Right.
Well, unless you go to a functional medicine doctor, you're not going to get somebody that looks at you holistically as a biological system that is, oh, by the way, part and parcel of the air that you breathe and the water that you drink and the
Mm.
thoughts that you have and so on and so forth. And
Absolutely.
again, even the medical system is a product of reductionism. And
Yes.
actually, in my opinion, that's actually getting worse.
Yeah. I think that's the perfect analogy because, I mean, there's no better example of a complex adaptive system than the human body. And
Absolutely.
every single part of that is connected. So you may be having a headache that's related to what you
Mhm.
ate
Mhm.
for dinner last night.
Mhm.
And the headache doctor is going to solve for something that's happening in your head. So
Right.
yeah,
Right.
so I think it's a perfect, I completely reduced that to simplistic, but I think it's a great analogy to help people understand interdependencies and complexity as well. And I love the point about kind of going at it from childhood, because I actually think um, children probably have a greater capacity to understand complexity than adults in a way, because they don't always think of things in a linear fashion, and
Mhm.
they're uh, they allow themselves to be abstracted. They don't quite understand everything in the
Mhm.
world yet anyway. Nobody's really imposed that on them. So I think you're right that forcing children into chairs 8 hours a day in a
Exactly.
very
Mhm.
structured environment is
Mhm.
actually to the detriment
Mhm.
of all of us.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I
Super
think it's
interesting.
unfortunate because again, we sort of pride ourselves on our education system and all of the luxuries that we have of being able to, go to specialty schools. Um, but again, we fail to teach methodology and critical thinking skills in a way that reflect the world that we actually live in, which is in a constant state of change. There's no end state there. I want to get that back in again, but I mean, we're in a
Yeah.
constant state of change.
Yeah.
And I think children, you're absolutely right, are adaptive. They're curious, and until we drive that curiosity out of them and we, instill conformity to a certain degree, um, I think, we've got a problem. I mean, right now, actually, I mean, it sounds sort of maybe doesn't make sense, but in some cases, we've actually taken the guardrails away from our children in some respects. Um, but we're not basically showing them how to think about all the things that they're perhaps observing. There's sort of this rebellious nature that is very much in play right now in our school systems. But again, unless we're able to help them understand, it's not all an issue. It's
Mhm.
not all, and the way they're thinking about it is it's very reductionist. They want to break it down, break it down, break it down, break it down, break it down. Every single micro issue is an
Mhm.
issue without the explanation of, yes, of course, it's all related. But you
Right.
can't just solve and have a grievance over X and assume that, if it ever got fixed, would solve your problem that you're
Mhm.
concerned about. And again, this is reductionism, 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 which is the antithesis. Is, nonlinearity is the opposite of that.
Exactly. Is that do you think on purpose? Do you think that kind of progression towards that absolute reductionist thinking has been um
I don't
it
know if
just
on
happened?
purpose is the right word. I think what has come out of reductionism, especially in the academic setting, is scientism, if you will,
Mhm.
and credentialism has enforced and reinforced certain behaviors. There's a sort of a I'm more superior. I'm hashtag science TM. We've heard this out of, our public health officials. I am the science,
Yeah.
you know. And I think not necessarily has that been done on purpose, but there
Mhm.
is a reward for being an expert.
Right.
There's a reward for somehow or other being, very narrowly focused on a particular topic. We actually reward that.
Yes.
And somebody like me sits back and I think, I'm not sure why you got that, that prize, that prestigious prize or whatever, that honor, because in reality, you did not understand, as you're making a public health declaration, you did not understand the economic influences, the educational collapse, all of the other societal issues. You strictly solved for X. And what you ended up creating was a tsunami over here of problems,
Mhm.
intentional or not. But again, to my way of thinking, it's that reductionist mindset in the education system that's created these pillars of excellence, if you will, that is actually the problem.
Mhm. So I am a firm believer that it's never too late, that there's always something that we can do. So as adults who are questioning things, and I think largely our audience is here because they are questioning things, um, what can we do to start to understand this better? I mean, this 1 hour conversation is a great start, but there's so much more. So you've mentioned an author already. Are there other resources? There are other things people can do to start to understand this concept better?
I was sitting there thinking about my bibliography,
Mm.
which is extensive. If you go down the rabbit hole of the complexity sciences, it's actually it's chaos theory. It's there's so many things involved that fall under the umbrella of this, and that certainly you don't jump into this easily. Um, how do you start to think about nonlinearity? How do you think about complexity? How do you think about complex adaptive systems? It's tough to say, go read a book.
Sure.
Um, Again, I'm looking at this book right here. Emmanuel Wallerstein is a great start, just because
Great.
he was just so prolific in discussing systems. Um,
What about questions that people can
Yeah.
start asking
So I
themselves?
think questions that people can start asking themselves are maybe just very sort of introspective, reflective questions, which is, am I really looking at this the right way? What
Mhm.
did that person say? What did Shaq, my nickname Shaq, what did Shaq say, about this thing about, am I really viewing the world in a reductionist way? Why
Mhm.
should I push back on, this concept of fifth generation warfare? Maybe you just start there. Maybe you
Okay.
put two conversations together and you ask yourself, am I truly observing my reality in a reductionist way?
Mhm.
Start with that question. It's a little bit
Great.
hard, but start there, at least for the adults anyway. Start there.
Let's give people a little bit of a head start by going back to this idea of generational warfare. So we've mentioned fifth generation warfare, but let's take it back to, again, my simplistic understanding is, early days, it was kind of hand to hand combat. And then we had technological advances in terms of hardware, in terms of weaponry. And so what are kind of the steps there that lead us to this last concept of fifth generation warfare?
Well, again, I push back hard on the term fifth generation warfare
Hmm.
because, again, that's simply an evolutionary biological metaphor that
Right,
presumes that warfare somehow evolved.
right.
Warfare has never, quote unquote, evolved. What has changed is tactic, techniques, and procedures. What
Okay.
has changed is how we structure and orient ourselves on an adversarial issue, on a threat problem. What has changed is our capabilities. We used to have germ warfare, biological warfare. We've had, all of these other capabilities at our disposal. And we can go all the way back to, when we had armor and different changes in our capability to protect ourselves,
Right.
then changed our ability to, attack, an adversary. And typically it was always force on force. One force would line up on one side of the field and another force would line up on the other side of the field and they'd all charge each other. And, that was just a way of thinking and aligning and arraying themselves on the battlefield. But it has always been a state of change in sense of the fact that there's always been dynamics. We now have the capability with sensors and capabilities and so on and so forth to now look into that adversarial space and go, oh, okay, I can see where your forces are moving, or I can intercept your discussions on how to think about attacking us using psychological warfare capabilities, or I can, figure out ways, through our intelligence apparatus to get at your plans for, targeting the cognitive warfare space, war for the cognitive mind. But again, that's not generational. That's just changes in capability.
Right. Right. So the cognitive warfare piece perhaps isn't new necessarily. You're saying, that may have been in the mix for a while. What's perhaps new, especially since the COVID pandemic, is a realization that our hearts and minds are
Yes.
part of the battlefront.
Yes.
Um, so if we now have this increasing realization that actually there are tactics being used to try to change what I think or what I believe about myself, about others, about the
Mhm.
world. How can we protect ourselves against that?
Yeah. So that is whew, that is interesting. I have often said there are two things you need to be able to do. You need to be able to learn to keep your own counsel and find your voice. The keep your own counsel point is kind of where I want to go to on this part because we've got to be able to be sure in our own beliefs and where we want to go. And that resilience that we have to build up, if you will, I think is critical in terms of being able to resist um, that psychological warfare operation that's against us, where other people are trying to influence our way of thinking, influence our behavior, if you will. And it's tough. I mean, look, we do this. We go into other countries, and we talk about it's the war for the hearts and minds. That was the irregular warfare motto. We're going to win hearts and minds around the world in Vietnam or Iraq or somewhere some other place, and we have schoolhouses that are devoted to how to go about doing that. How do you win the hearts and minds? Is that considered a psychological operation? Is that a cognitive warfare operation? What does that look like? And
Hmm.
again, going back to our earlier discussion, we're not really aware of the fact that it could happen here. That's a warfare thing that happens again, overseas somewhere.
Of course.
So we're not necessarily thinking about, well, how do I resist that? How do
Hmm.
I go and make sure that I'm not going to be swayed or influenced by this massive effort in many cases, coordinated and again enabled through technology and all of the legal parameters that can be put on somebody to ensure that they behave a particular way and therefore think a particular way. How do we
Mhm.
resist that is a tough issue. It's a tough question to ask because again,
Yeah.
it's a sense of resilience. Somebody like me that I know I have, but it's very very challenging to pass that courage on to somebody else, that resilience onto somebody else, and explain it in a way that basically says, look, you need to harden up, you need to toughen up, you need to be able to be sure in your own way of thinking, and you need to, resist all the messaging around you that says conform, 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 or whatever the
Mhm.
message is, and then be assured, be aware of the consequences of that strength
Mhm.
as well. That's a challenge. And that again, that resilience of that individual, I think something happened in me, perhaps maybe in you, where we were just hardened at an early age, maybe through life experiences and world travel and education and so on and so forth. Not everybody has that background, so how do you instill that in somebody? I think I don't have the answer.
Yeah.
I think courage begets courage.
Yeah.
And maybe it just starts there. Somebody looks and says, "Well, she's doing it. Maybe I should
Mhm.
do it too." Um, but again, it goes back to there's so much out there right now that says, "Don't stick your head up out of that foxhole
Absolutely.
because we're going to target you."
And that goes to your other piece about finding your voice, which is
Yes.
hard to do for many of us in the best of times, but in the worst of times, or the times that we find ourselves in, which may or may not be the worst of times, could get worse.
Mhm.
It's hard to find your voice, and it's hard to have the courage to speak out when you know that you've seen other people who have been brought down just
Mhm.
for doing the exact same thing. It is hard, but the more of us that speak out, even quietly and
Mhm.
in very sort of gentle ways, as Dr. Matthias Desmet always talks about, it can
Absolutely.
be just a private conversation, and you don't challenge someone aggressively, but you continue to speak out. And the more of us that do that together and find each other and give each other that affirmation and the courage, I think that will help. I don't know if that will solve it, but it will certainly help.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, a message among many is don't self censor. Please do not self censor. Find your voice. Don't worry about it. If you've got a friend or a neighbor or a family member or a coworker, a stranger on the street that has a different opinion, don't shirk from your own opinion. If somebody had enough courage to express theirs,
Mhm.
don't self censor. Come back
Yeah.
with, have you thought about it this way? Come back with, I disagree. My opinion is this, and find that voice.
Yeah.
Just do
Yeah.
not self censor. I think that's probably very important. Again, if you're a parent, if you've got children or grandchildren, I think one of the early messages, going back to one of our previous discussion, an early message with a child is find your voice. As that little 3-year-old looks up there at you, and you're just like, oh my God, this is gonna be painful, right? But you want them to speak out, you want them to stand firm and whatever it is that they're doing. And of course, as they grow up, you've also got to deal with that. But
Yes. But give them the courage to know when something is right or wrong, that they have the ability and in fact the responsibility to say something. I
yeah.
think that's a beautiful message to end on. I know we're coming to the end of an hour, and I so appreciate it. I would love to keep talking with you, but before we go, just tell people how they can follow you and learn more about your work.
So I'm predominantly active on X. You can find me at DRC_Shackelford. That's Dr. Crisanna Shackelford, DRC_Shackelford. That's largely where I post a lot of my efforts, interviews like this, discussions that I believe are important on topics that I predominantly discuss, which is largely within the defense realm, defense readiness, redefining defense readiness. Um, just as a complete aside, and we really haven't even talked about it, I started a nonprofit, and
Mhm.
I'm also an advocate for our service members who may or may not have been harmed. specifically with regard to vaccine injuries and gene therapy injuries. So I can be found at Real Reactions NP, where I set up a nonprofit to raise money for those that have been harmed. We issue direct grants to applicants through the donations that we receive. I write on Substack. You can find me at Interdependencies. As I've talked about, and I've used the word interdependencies many, many times in here. I think it reflects sort of my thought processes. I sometimes just sit here at the computer and try to sort of just find a way to explain in simple terms things like nonlinearity, why we shouldn't use the word fifth generation warfare. So again, you can find me, and those are predominantly the main places you can find me most of the time.
That's fantastic. And I would love to have you back to talk a little bit more about your nonprofit and the harms to the military. So if you can find it in your schedule in the next coming months, that would be wonderful.
I'd love to do that. I think it's a critically important topic, and it impacts all of our discussions about warfare when you talk about the state of our defense readiness posture, and how the last 3 or 4 years have impacted what we've done to our armed forces and what is happening with regard to many of those other changes. So it's an important nexus conversation. I'd love to continue.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Doctor. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
We're so thankful for guests like Dr. Shackelford to come on this podcast and help us make sense of our constantly changing world. And we're so grateful to you as well for watching, subscribing, and sharing this video. We call Collapse Life a thinking person's guide to civilization and demise, and we're very happy to have you here. If you're not already following us on Substack, please become a subscriber at collapselife.substack.com. We are also on X at collapse_life, so please join us there too. We're looking forward to seeing you back here next week for another episode of this podcast. Until then, remember to keep your chin up. It's only collapse. See you soon.